Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the latest Lares webinar, Tabletop Exercise and TTP Replay, the win-win combination we undervalue. Today we'll be discussing how combining tabletop exercises with emulation of adversary behaviors can enhance your overall security posture. And wherever you may be watching, thank you for joining us. We will be monitoring the comments section and answering your questions, and we would love to meet with you and discuss any of these topics in more detail after the webinar. I'm Mike Crouch. I am the lead engineer with the Lares Adversarial Collaboration Unit. I have 25 years of experience in information and cybersecurity, playing on different types of colored teams, red teams, blue teams, purple teams, planned and executed hundreds of adversarial engagements from different perspectives, stealthy ninjas, stealing pirate, sage, Jedi wisdom type collaborations. So lots of adversarial collaboration, lots of detection engineering, lots of threat hunting across that 25 years. And I'm a 10-year veteran of the U.S. military. So cut my chops on some military networks and Department of Defense networks. But I'm also joined today by Dr. Mark Arnold, Vice President of Adversarial Services here at Lares. Mark, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Mike, for handing the baton. Again, my name is Mark Arnold, VP of Advisory Services. Have over 25 plus years in cyber and technology, 8 of those years in leadership roles. I've been helping clients over those years in Fortune 500s, Fortune 1000s, build maturity models and blueprints to optimize their risk management and security postures. Particular focuses on cloud security, but as of late, really engaged in the intersection of nation-state attacks and information ops that are impacting certain societal groups, and really leaning into that these days. Got some degrees, but my real, I'd say, piece that I'm really have been excited about is spending time in the community as a community advocate. So I've been on a few boards, InfoSec World, OWASP chapter leader in the past, and Source Conference out of Boston. And so my pleasure to be here today with Mike to talk about this very, I think, worthwhile subject.
Thank you, Mark. Glad you could join us today. Before we dive too deep into the subject, I wanted to go over a blog post that we saw earlier this week. Actually, it was published in November of last year. The Immersive Labs benchmark workforce report for 2025. Again, it came out in November, but it has some interesting to say about how people are training for adversarial engagements. Their data exposes some systemic patterns that prevent organizations from achieving demonstrable resilience. Some of the significant findings from the report: 94% of organizations believe they could effectively detect, respond to, and recover from a major incident. In practice, teams are only achieving about 22% detection accuracy or decision accuracy, and on average are taking 29 hours to contain the simulated attacks. The resilience scores have remained statistically flat over the past couple of years, and the median response time of 17 days to complete a threat intelligence lab. 60% of all training in immersive labs still focuses on vulnerabilities more than 2 years old, leaving teams overprepared for yesterday's threats. Most common exercises remain at the fundamental level at 36%. That limits progression into intermediate and advanced readiness, which leads to stalled maturity and shrinking adaptability as organizations master outdated playbooks while new attack techniques evolve. And only 41% of organizations are including cross-functional teams in simulations, even though 90% believe cross-functional coordination is strong. So true readiness demands rehearsed coordination across every function, not just the security team. So having said that, Mark, we're here to talk about tabletops and TTP replay. Each has its role and its function. Technical tabletops, business risk tabletops, each has its function and purpose. Talk to us a little bit about the function and purpose of each of those and how they're going to impact the organization.
Yeah, both of those are important. We feel that there's a broad perspective on what those particular scenarios are and should be, given business priorities and prioritizations and what the business is really concerned about. When we think about the technical leaning tabletops, we're asking, is the SIM doing what it's supposed to do? When there's an incident that triggers, are the right team members in place? Is there enough capacity to respond to said incidents or triggers? From the business perspective, We're concerned about coordination, collaboration, decision making. What's the governance that exists within an organization? What are the business, again, concerns and risk that the business is most invested in making sure that they can operate under pressure? And so we're looking at process and procedures, how owners act under pressure. Obviously, we're looking at communication, making sure that it's not just something on paper, a placeholder, but actually populate with names of folks who can respond in the face of an incident. We're looking at escalation paths and thinking about any regulatory reporting requirements that might trigger also in the launch of an incident. And I think that those are the concerns that we think about across organizations across various sectors.
So a lot of organizations are onboarding a business information security officer, the BISO. Can that tend to be the bridge between technical exercises and business risk exercises?
I think you're spot on to what we're seeing across our clients. The BISO has basically a foot on the technical side and also has an interfacing role with the governance side. And so I think that holistically gives that individual important experiences on both sides of the fence, as it were, and is able to contribute and provide perspectives that help us shape what the tabletop exercise scenarios should look like in the end.
And so from a TTP replay perspective, from cross-functional teams, I haven't had too many replay engagements that involve the public affairs office, HR, and if the legal team's involved, it's usually just to review the statement of work. So not a lot of cross-functionality there. Typically, they're more on the technical side. TTP replay in the broadest sense, it's just a type of purple teaming. These engagements are also, they're objective driven, and the objectives tend to fit into one or more of three categories. You're either testing or retesting current detections, you're identifying detection gaps, or you're training your team. While your replay objectives could fit into one or all three of those categories, functionally, it could best be described as taking the output of a previous engagement, like a red team or a pen test, and replaying the behaviors or TTPs to measure the effectiveness of technical controls. I like to think of tabletops typically deal with people, process, and policy, where TTP replays, or in purple teams in general, they're closer to the keyboard. And from a people perspective, they tend to focus on the analysts and engineers that triage security events and alerts. And from a process perspective, they tend to focus on the artifacts that generate those events and alerts. So if each has its function and role, what are those objectives? What questions are we trying to answer with each of these? Let's start with tabletops.
Yeah, I think tabletops ask the question, as we see in our slide, if the attack lands, can we coordinate a response at all? I mean, we're looking for any common gaps that might emerge in the exercise itself. Is the design focused on items that are important, like stakeholder sequencing? We want to make sure that rather than assume that the CISO knows who to speak to in the light that there is an incident, God forbid, a breach. When do they speak to the executive level team? Is it before or after containment? Do we loop in public relations? You mentioned them briefly as a particular cross-functional team that might get brought in. Is it before something is publicly known or after? We want to make sure that in the context of running the exercises, that we're detecting whatever gaps there might be in the coordination process, in the collaboration, in sequencing, decision making, making sure that what we see on paper doesn't break down under pressure.
Yeah, I agree. TTP replays are asking similar questions, but I think from a different perspective. This is where we start thinking about control coverage versus control effectiveness. Are we getting out the MITRE attack framework and we're just trying to play bingo and cover as many squares as we can? Or are we actually looking at specific behaviors in our environment that are of concern because we understand that they're threats and we want to be more effective in our coverage? So TTP replay is concerned with artifacts in the environment. Does the telemetry exist to capture suspicious or potentially malicious behavior? And are the search criterias and queries and correlations built to detect and alert and possibly block that behavior? So we're asking the same questions, I think, just from different ends of the spectrum. Do we have the right decision-making process in place, and do we have the right artifact collection and detection process in place? Would you agree?
I think you bring up something important when you mention control coverage versus control effectiveness. We're seeing in some of our client engagements where we're specifically performing risk assessments or gap analysis. They say, Mark, that's great. you gave us a pretty fair score. But how do we know that we actually have controls that are effective under testing? Stress them to make sure that they are operating as designed. There's that saying, you don't know if you can stay in the ring until after you receive that first punch. And so, from our perspective, better to test that before we find ourselves in a situation. And so, there is more and more we're being asked that question. Go beyond just the coverage assessments. Actually, test us to vet the effectiveness of the controls that we've invested in.
Yeah, and sometimes those can be very large investments. So we're looking at tabletops versus replay. We're looking at one or the other. I don't know that we necessarily have to say that. We're not saying that it's an either or, that individual testing is ineffective. Would you agree? We're definitely not saying that one is better, or that they're ineffective on their own. I think replays find the technical truth and tabletops find the operational truth. Neither alone gives you a full picture. So we're emphasizing merging, not replacing. Would you agree?
Oh, I absolutely agree. We've had some conversations with clients, about, what are we projecting? What are our assertions here? Our assertions here are both are important independently, even mutually exclusive. But we believe that the intersection of the two provides us even greater value to uncover those truths, both organizationally and technically, in the face of an incident.
So typically, in my experience, you have tabletop assumptions are getting stress tested by your TTP replays, and your replay findings are getting contextualized and prioritized through tabletop decision making. So we've talked about merging. So why do they both matter? I think we can see that there's several reasons. One, you had talked about ownership gaps. Do you have the right cross-functional teams based on the scenario? So this gives you an opportunity to identify where you might have gaps in your playbook.
I absolutely would concur there. When we're running these, there's this typical list of items that we're trying to test. And then in the midst of the exercise, a lot of conversation about who owns this. Do we just have placeholders, or do we have actual decision makers who can mobilize the team and own their part of the response in the face of incidents? I think another thing that comes out here is sequencing, not just responding to an event in a particular time or the mean time to respond or whatever metric is in place. But there are other timelines, like compliance timelines, that might be requisite for a particular organization in a particular sector. There are brand management issues that flare up. We don't normally test those, but we at Lares typically pull in social media teams so that they're tested. Some organizations want to ensure that they own the narrative. There are solutions out there for brand management, but typically, having people, not just technology, but people in place who are watching where narratives are evolving before the organization, wants to either publicly engage the public regarding a particular incident. And so we test those as well. Those often become decision bottlenecks that we can avoid if we exercise them in the context of a tabletop exercise.
Exactly. Also gives the participants an opportunity to see where detections are falling short. We assumed the firewall would catch the inject. Let's actually see if it does. You'll actually have some telemetry to prove your assumptions. And everyone on the exercise can see whether that assumption is true or whether that assumption is failing or falling short. It also gives the participants an opportunity to learn from each other by seeing their unique perspectives on the attack. So it raises it not just from a notional cross-functional decision-making stakeholder type of engagement, but the technical engineers, analysts can see and learn from the stakeholders and decision makers on how they see the threat as risk. So it starts helping to bridge that threat to risk communication, sometimes get bogged down in when we're talking security programs and security projects. So again, this is another area where we see control coverage versus controlled effectiveness. So are you validating, not just assuming? And it's not, again, let's not get out the MITRE ATT&CK framework and just start trying to cover as many boxes as possible. But have we built our detections and our correlation searches to be effective and find, detect, and possibly block the behavior that we're concerned about? Lastly, readiness becomes evidence-backed. We don't have to guess. Things are getting proven, and we have metrics to back that up. Talk to us a little bit about how important metrics are in these types of exercises.
I think for a lot of our engagements, the goal is maturity, continuous improvement. we need metrics to get us from current state to target state. I think these exercises, especially combined, move us with a greater velocity to those goals, to those objectives. We need exercises. We create certain outputs. We can measure them, determine whether or not they meet our targets in terms of how the business responds to a particular incident. Continually wash, rinse, repeat. Run the exercises again with the inputs, feedback that we're getting from them, and again use what's being generated from the evidence that's being created and map those to our organizational objectives. We can look at that as tangible evidence to say whether or not we're getting better or not. But definitely need the evidence to bring us to that path.
Maturity does seem to be the goal oftentimes, doesn't it?
It is on our side of the business.
Yeah. So I like to think of this a great visual and a great way to explain this to some folks who may not be on the webinar with you. One brain, one nervous system. So think of the tabletop exercise as the brain. It's going to help expose the cracks, the gaps, see where decisions need to be made. And the TTP replay is verifying those injects, those artifacts, those assumptions. So it's the nervous system. It's gathering the sensory input to feed to the brain so it can make decisions. And together they're going to create that defensible, data-backed security. So how do we do that? How do we combine these so that we get a nice engagement? Step one, pick a real threat scenario. So it needs to be relevant and it needs to be something that realistically could impact your organization. Typically, when I've been involved in tabletop exercises, this is one of the areas where I see a lot of participants check out. They'll read a summary of the scenario and their first response is, that'll never happen here. And then we've lost them for the rest of the engagement. The cool thing about combining these two types of exercises, tabletops and TTP replays, is they tend to start from the same point. When you're doing a purple team, you need some sort of relevant threat intelligence to lead how you're going to build out your exercise. When you're talking about tabletop exercises, it has to be a believable, relevant scenario that could impact the organization. Mark, what's been your experience with trying to get this first step so that you have engaged stakeholders?
To be honest with you, Mike, we've gotten some pushback in some scenarios where the teams that have gathered to participate in that launch, everyone's raring to go. We introduced the first set of injects, and then we get some hands raised. Mark, this is not realistic. Is this something that our business is really going to see at any time or authentically? And for me, the pushback is not a reason to halt the scenario definition stage. For me, that's an invitation because for me, client input is the raw material for authentic scenarios. And so we relish the fact that we get some pushback. I think that helps us become real collaborators. We are facilitators kind of off to the side. That allows the participating teams in the tabletop exercise to really flesh out what is realistic, or maybe what's really important to the business. Each of the teams has their priorities for testing. At the end of the day, from the vCISO side, we're trying to listen to the business to understand what has the biggest business value for them from the outcome of defining a scenario that makes sense for them.
Yes, agreed. Sometimes it's hard to find that sweet spot between believability and something that everybody's interested in. Step two, we want to actually run the tabletop exercise. So we need to assign tasks, run injects, capture our assumptions, capture our decisions, make sure we've identified the right owners and that all those cross-functional teams are engaged, get our stakeholder input, and make sure we have the right escalation path. So this is a big incident response area. Do we have the right playbook? Is the playbook up to date? Again, in a lot of the tabletops I've been involved with, this is the second place where we tend to lose a lot of participants. And the assumption, hey, we run an inject, and the assumption is, well, the firewall would block that. Well, if it's just a tabletop, how do you validate that the firewall can block that? Or at this point, we would call so-and-so and have them do something, right? Well, are you going to call so-and-so and have them do something? Or are we just documenting that would happen and we move on to the next inject? So Mark, talk to us about those types of drawbacks to tabletops and some of the assumptions that are made and some of the flaws or places where we can fall short in our tabletops when we make some of those assumptions.
I think you kind of broached some of that already, when we're committed to a certain set of test exercises, especially those that involve technical expertise. I've seen this in exercises, perhaps, run by legal or someone outside of the technical side of the house. And they're asked to vet whether or not an inject, kind of like the one you described, where we're talking about a firewall or did something trigger in the SIM, and is that conversation, right? It's more conversational on the table tabletop exercise side to kind of vet, what happens next, and is the conversation a way to pressure test the scenario assumption, or do we need to do a little bit more? And so for some, I've seen some heads in the room nodding, yeah, that might happen. That could happen. I'm not sure that would happen. All of that comes out in conversation. All those assumptions need to be tested, even as we're talking about them, as we're jotting them down on paper or listening them on the whiteboard. At some point, curating all those assumptions, we need to go back and make sure that we again identify that we actually have the right people in the room who can speak to those questions, to what you kind of frame as drawbacks. Are the escalation paths reflecting how the operation would actually, or the organization would actually operate under that pressure? Do the scenarios again reflect true threats? Would that thing that we put on the board genuinely be plausible or material in our exercise? I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think you're spot on, which I think leads us to step 3. That's a great segue for step 3, which is converting the scenario into a TTP playbook. So we're taking the output of that previous exercise, just like we would with any purple team or TTP replay. We're going to take exercise output from the tabletop and build a playbook, and we're going to use it for defining the attacker behaviors and techniques based on the tabletop. So all those assumptions, all those decisions, everything that was output and documented as output for the tabletop is now going to become input and help us build out attacker scenarios and emulation techniques and behaviors for the TTP replay. This is where we loop in the stakeholders. And I think it was really important we were talking about selecting a scenario and making sure it was believable and it was plausible. This is a good point as we're building out that behavior playbook to start going back to the exercise participants and saying, where did we fall short? Or are we getting this attacker emulation correct? Are we building out the right scenarios based on the assumptions and some of the things that you discussed in your tabletop exercise? Are we getting it right? Did we hit the right points? Are we going to emulate the right are we reading the output from the tabletop correctly as we build these scenarios? So we're creating a feedback loop to talk to the participants in the tabletop to get that stakeholder input, understand better what the decision makers were trying to decide and how they were trying to implement those decisions so that we can test them. And again, this is going to help close that chasm between your engineer analysts talking threat and your stakeholders and decision makers talking risk. How do we address threats that potentially lead to risks? So this is a really important step, and I think that's why we've put the whole stakeholder input. Hopefully this is where that loop and feedback comes from as you're constantly tuning the scenarios for the playbook, the TTP replay playbook, and whatever the scenario was for the tabletop exercise. Are those two outcomes and expectations matching up?
Absolutely. I think you're touching upon an important cog in this conversation, is that we have to have organizational context for anything that we are testing. Does a ransomware scenario feel generic, or is it something that we heard in an ISAC conversation? We heard from our partners in a particular sector. Maybe we need to be talking about third-party vendor privilege access because someone in our sector are starting to see heat from attackers for a particular threat path, or we're having a merger, and then have we checked that all the networks have been brought under the governance of the acquisition team, OT environments, or what are the scenarios that are worth building? Because when we think about these, especially this feedback loop that's providing organizational context, I think one of the questions that it's addressing is the authenticity problem. Is what we are testing real? Is it solvable? But is it bringing in all the necessary inputs to get us to that decision, whether or not to ride with that particular TTX into the TTP, or do we use the loop to feedback and
Right.
keep adjusting until we get good alignment between the team? that are participating.
Once again, we're back to coverage versus effectiveness. Are we playing, MITRE
I,
bingo, or are we
I
looking at
agree.
what we really care about? Step 4, replay the TTPs against your environment. So we're going to execute the behaviors, and we're going to generate telemetry. We're going to gather alert data. We're going to look for visibility gaps and response timing. So if the intent is to exercise mean time to detect and mean time to response, this is a perfect place to do that. Did we get an alert? How long is it going to take our team to find the attack or the emulated scenario? So we're gathering that alert data. Is that alert going to come in email? Is it going to get automatically generated in a ticketing system so that you can work the ticket? Is it tier 1? Is it tier 2? What level of triage is this particular emulation going to get targeted for? Did we assign it correctly? So anything and everything you would normally do in a purple team exercise is you're replaying those scenarios and those attack behaviors, or a red team, or this is the hands-on keyboard portion. So we're generating artifacts in the environment, and hopefully we're gathering the correct information and the correct artifacts to respond appropriately at all levels. Now that we're talking about engaging and bringing these together, are we responding correctly at all levels? Not just that level 1 triage, not just the SOC, not just incident response, but does our playbook say that we at some point we engage the CISO, or we engage a cross-functional team, or we do other things? And now you have the artifacts to do that instead of just notionally saying we're going to make something happen. So really important step to replay those TTPs against your environment.
Absolutely.
All right, step 5. We're going to compare the telemetry and map that telemetry back to the tabletop. Another opportunity for some stakeholder input, creating that loop, comparing the telemetry with tabletop assumptions. We assumed firewall would detect it. All right, well, did it actually detect it? Did we get telemetry? Did we get an alert? Did it block what we thought it was going to block? Conversely, this is going to expose detection gaps. We thought the firewall would catch it. It did not. This is an opportunity for some detection engineering or possible threat hunting, building out new detections and creating new capabilities. Again, not just to cover a square on our MITRE bingo, but to look at the things that are most impactful and most important in our environment. So we definitely want to map all of our findings in the TTP replay back to the assumptions we had from our tabletop exercise. And then step 6, lather, rinse, repeat. We want to fix and retest, tune the detections that need to be tuned, update your playbooks, clarify ownership, validate your improvements. Again, you're collecting metrics at this point. Metrics drive maturity so that we know that we're continuously improving our processes, which very important to the stakeholders and decision makers. We're not staying stagnant. So Mark, we're going to talk about some benefits to this process, but how does this feedback loop, particularly the fix and retest? So people's time's precious. And it seems like we're just in this continuous loop of building exercises, testing things, fixing things. You're always going to be doing some kind of engagement. That's not always the case. So how do we do this effectively without consuming everybody's time?
Mike, I think you're again spot on. Capacity to continuously loop through these exercises in an iterative fashion that could weigh very heavily on them, on folks, get fatigued, and folks retire or back out of such activities. But from a vCISO perspective, we feel that mapping the telemetry is so important to the TTX. It's about closing that loop between, again, what the exercises assumed, what would happen, and what the environment actually produces. So for us in practice, I believe the core idea is, as we're going through the TTX, these loops are important from a real scenario perspective. And again, opening, it's very conversational. The discussions that these exercises produce challenge our set of assumptions without talking about this ad nauseum. Would this thing detect X, and would the SOC alert on Y behavior? And then would the right person in governance actually understand what the folks in the SOCs would be saying to them? As a VC, so we're often in the position of trying to translate between the C-suite's confidence in their controls and the reality on the ground. And so, yes, in some instances, there's fatigue created, but the TTX, along with the TTP, for us surfaces a stated capability. The telemetry that the TTP folks are generating demonstrates capability. It's not just assumed capability, but it's demonstration at the end of the day. And so our aim is that the gap between those two kind of narrows our risk exposure, and it's exactly where we need to be at the end of such exercises to articulate our effectiveness to the board.
Well said. Well said. Particularly, I liked you brought in the GRC. There are lots of different regulatory mandates and compliance mandates that are making that are saying, hey, organization, you have to do some sort of testing, whether it's red teaming, pen testing, vulnerability assessments. There's testing involved with a lot of these, and this is a good way to get on top of some of the other mandates and find those gaps in some of your compliance mandates, or that will address some of your compliance mandates.
Yeah, yeah, testing and timelines, right? So
Yeah,
GDPR, the California Consumer Privacy Act, you know, we we assume that we can respond within their required timelines if, for notification and the like. Again, these should also be assumptions that are validated and demonstrated as an outcome of these exercises, along with detection capability and making sure that those are demonstrated. So again, it's a mishmash of things, but all assumptions should be tested.
agreed. So let's talk benefits. We've talked a lot about tabletops, TTP replays, why we think you should be connecting those two types of exercises. So what's the benefits? First off, vendor accountability. People are throwing millions of dollars at vendors for the magic solution. Mark, what's your take on vendor accountability when we're talking about these types of exercises?
Yeah, I knew you were going to throw that one at me. Been in a lot of organizations where either you are one of the haves and you can buy two or three of everything, and two of and three of everything doesn't solve your problem. I think what the TTX and TTP combination, that value prop for combining the two, helps us, with our vendor risk management programs, our third party risk management services, who um, are our partners, downstream, third party, fourth party, nth party. Are they actually meeting the SLAs? Well, we can use the combination of these exercises to hold vendors responsible, to drive our return on investment, and then also ROSI, the return on security investment. We're seeing more of those calculations being driven by chief risk officers. They're concerned that the more you buy should be driving down risk, and so I think we can leverage these exercises, especially leveraging them combined, to give us metrics to answer those questions. Are we getting the best bang for our buck and not just buying the next shiny thing?
Yeah, shiny things. Another benefit I think we get from engaging these two exercises together is we start to see, again, this is a great way to delineate between coverage versus effectiveness with gap quantification. We can actually see the gaps in our detection. We've validated it, we've proven it, or we've disproven it, whichever way you want to look at it. And it helps prioritize those high value or most urgent detections that need to be built so that you just don't have this endless queue of detection engineering tickets that have to be built. Well, we need to build this detection because we don't have it covered. Well, do you really need it covered? If you're not heavy in Linux, do you need bash detections? Maybe not. That could be lower priority than some of the things that are getting validated as part of an exercise flow. So quantifying those and making sure that you're prioritizing high value and urgent detections because they're effective as opposed to just having them. I think that's a huge benefit from this type of exercise flow. I think another benefit, and Mark, you've hit it on a few times, is maturity. Realistic scenarios prepare for actual situations. Train as you fight, as we would say in the military. What's the benefit of maturing your organization? I mean, it sounds kind of intuitive, and it sounds like, why are we even asking this? But what's the benefit of maturing your capabilities in your organization through these types of exercises?
I think they're tantamount, right? Our slide says IR maturity. When we think about it, IR maturity often in organizations is a standalone capability, but we should be thinking about IR maturity as a subset of organizational maturity. And we can have technically proficient response teams that still fail during actual incidents because the organizational tissue that should be in place to tie both together isn't really there. The playbooks exist, but no one outside the SOC knows their role, or they're organically grown. It's only a handful of of owners and operators really know what is what in times of uncertainty. And so practically maturity improvements should have targets, right? Certain thresholds that organizations are going after. There should be a framing of why we're doing the exercises for not just for the sake of saying we did well, but uh, optimizing our investments. And then our IR program spend is able to be better defined to leadership because it frames or reframes the IR maturity as a shared organizational responsibility rather than just a security team deliverable. And so we're looking at all these inputs. As the saying goes, as one goes, the entire goes. We want to think about this as a holistic maturity model that at the end of the day, these tabletop exercises combined with the TTP replays gets us from current state to optimized states. That's the name of the game.
So the next big benefit is going to be board evidence, which I think is, again, that's another thing that's pivotal in the threat to risk translation. Boards don't care if our firewall is going to block something, but they do care about business risk to the environment and how that firewall might play into that business risk, not necessarily whether it can block individual types of tactics or techniques or behaviors. So with there being a mandate to keep boards informed on our maturity, as our security maturity, and keeping them trained on cybersecurity issues, how do these types of engagements, and particularly combining them and merging these engagements, keep our board updated and educated?
Well, boards are watching. They're watching the wild, right? They're watching peer organizations survive or not survive technical breaches or get destroyed by the response. Think about MGM, one example. The operational, and we've not really mentioned a lot today, the reputational damage vastly exceeded what a mature response would have cost. And so when we think about these combined exercises, thinking about keeping risk to an acceptable level, a manageable level. We're thinking about brand management. We're thinking about reputational management in the same framework as we're thinking about handling incidents. So boards care when someone connects, say, IR maturity to the outcomes they're already responsible for, like stock price, regulatory standing, customer trust, leadership, continuity. And these cannot be looked at separately, but they need to be looked at organically or as connected tissue where, the board is responsible for making sure that that organization thrives and is dependent upon hearing that their teams are actually vetting and testing and providing demonstrable artifacts that speak to the fact that the org that they're running is again trying to optimize their maturity and is engaged in continuous improvement. I know that's a mouthful, but uh, those are my thoughts there.
Well, and speaking of continuous improvement, that's a huge benefit from looping these two exercise types together. Not only does it help make future decisions, but it seems like that's the board and C-suite is looking. It's like continuous everything, continuous improvement, continuous threat exercise management, continuous integration. It's continuous everything.
Huh.
So it seems to help make those future
All the things,
decisions.
yeah.
Yeah, future all the things and continuous all the things. Yep. So where does Lares fit in to this? How does Lares fit into that? Well, webinars like this, having the conversation about tabletops are great. Purple teaming, TTP replay, they're great. They serve a function, they serve a role. Had you thought about merging them and you putting them together and building that functional feedback loop? So we can design scenarios rooted in business risk or business input, threat intelligence. We can definitely help execute TTP replays with adversarial precision. And we can help with the findings and help build defensible, actionable evidence. So Mark, talk to us about some of the clients and customers you've helped with these processes.
Like I can think of one in particular in Fiserv. Have been a long time client partner. Start off with um, vulnerability assessment, pen tests, and then we start getting them to think about linking those to a maturity timeline. Think of a testing loop of as your maturity grows, tying that testing to say a NIST CSF or another particular framework. And we had them look at their testing program as not just as a point in time, as a VA or pen test would give us, but think about as they mature to start um, evolving their testing. One of these scenarios led to a situation where we had to do a retest, and after a long conversation about, hey, you did well on the risk assessment, but here are the gaps that the tester found in a time block pen test. Let's do some TTP replays. They were hesitant at first, but after the TTP replay engagement, euphoria in the room. I mean, jumping jacks, cartwheels, because they were found themselves as ride along partners. We're not. It turned out that we're not the ones going in and whacking them to death, but here we are as partners, and they're able to see as our team is throwing stuff at their network, at the controls that we called out, and they're actually asked to turn some knobs and then get tested again, and then see the success of turning that knob. That collaboration blew them away, and after that fact, that's all the test. That's the only type of testing they wanted to do, and so very demonstrable example of where this type of example has evidence backing that folks are finding value in the combination of the two types of exercises.
Absolutely. Engaging with partners that want to see you succeed across your different types of testing, your different testing engagements. And we definitely can fit in there and help in any capacity that you would want us to or would allow us to function. So hopefully we've demonstrated a path to defensible security, that we can stop guessing about what's going on in our environment and start proving with some evidence-backed readiness when we combine tabletop and TTP replay. We want to thank everybody wherever you may be watching. Thank you again for joining us. We do have, we're going to leave behind a couple of little presents for you. The 6-step process that we outlined, that's going to be in the webinar description and linked on our website. And we have a frequently asked question document that we've been collecting. That too will be linked in the description and on our website. Again, we'll be looking for and responding to any of your questions or comments. So please engage with us, and we'd love to meet with you and discuss any of these topics. And if you'd like to contact us, there's a couple of ways to contact us here on this last slide. So again, thank you, and we look forward to hearing from any and all of you real soon.
Thanks all. Thanks for joining in.